Ireland Woods. So nice to hear, too, from someone who was raised in unity. That's just great. So this month we are in the practice of beginning again. We talked about that a little bit last week, about how important it is to become as a child and to have a fresh mind as we approach life, no matter how old we are or how many times we've done something. We're also celebrating our roots today, our unity roots and our beginnings, and how Charles and Myrtle Fillmore, our co-founders, began this movement over 130 years ago almost. So in order to begin again, we must become as little children. We must have open minds. We must be curious. In Romans chapter 12, verse 2, St. Paul said, "Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind." Now, to be transformed by the renewing of our mind takes discipline, takes love, takes grace, it takes action, and it takes effort. And sometimes we can get lazy, or we can get caught up in the things that are happening in the world, and we kind of just let that go. So one of the basic tenets of unity, our third teaching, is the law of mind action. And we all know it, right? Thoughts held in mind produce after their kind. Well, the truth is that that goes for both positive and negative thoughts. So when we have positive thoughts, they produce after their kind. And so we have more positive thoughts. We're surrounded maybe with positive people. However, there's also, when we have negative thoughts, they also produce after their kind, do they not? So if we get into a negative thinking spiral, have you ever been in one? You can kind of go down and down and down, and that also produces after its kind. And then we surround ourselves in situations where it just seems to get worse. So becoming as a child means that we're curious, we're open. It also means that we let go of our preconceived ideas about others and about ourselves. Because the biggest thing that can stop us from beginning again is a thought that says, you can't, I can't, or nobody cares, or why should I, or it doesn't matter. And those are the thoughts that can stop us before we even get started. So one of my questions is then, how do we counteract that energy when we find ourselves in it? Now, there's a word that the monks in the 17th century used to describe that feeling of ennui. And it would happen to monks who were in isolation and were living a very monastic life. And it was called acedia. And acedia basically kind of meant like, not just slothfulness, not laziness, but almost kind of a detachment and an uncaring. And it was a word that kind of disappeared for a while, but it reappeared again after World War II, and we're starting to hear that word a little more again, probably because there are so many big problems that we are faced with that sometimes it's easier just to step back and say, I don't care, and to step in to the feeling of acedia. A woman named Kathleen Norris wrote a book called Assyria and Me. And she said that the monks would call it the noonday demon. So not a real demon, but a noonday demon of just sort of, again, like this slothfulness and this uncaring. And she said, I would suggest that while depression is an illness treatable by counseling and medication, acedia is a vice that is best countered by spiritual practice and the discipline of prayer. So there needs to be some kind of an action to be taken to pull ourselves out of acedia, whether it be in nature or, prayer or meditation. It's like the story of the prodigal son, which I know you've heard a million times, right? It's the son who has the inheritance, and he goes away, and then he loses everything, and he's got nothing, and he decides he wants to go back, but he's not really expecting anything from his father. He'll be happy just to be a servant in the house, but his father not only greets him, but runs out to greet him and says, I'm so happy you're here, and he throws a party for him. And it's the same thing when we turn back toward spiritual practice, when we turn back toward God, when we turn back toward love, just taking that one step, and it comes rushing back to us, right? God meets us more than halfway. And so there's that process of moving out of that experience. Now, St. Paul also said in the book of Romans, he said, I do not understand what I do, for what I want to do, I do not do. But what I hate, I do. Can you relate to this? I don't understand what I do, for what I want to do, I do not do, but what I hate, I do. And so it's like, okay, I know that I, should be meditating every morning, but I don't do it maybe all the time. I know I should be doing all these things, but I don't do them. So this situation is thousands of years old. We didn't invent it. It's not with a modern world. It's been going on for a long time. Now, acedia can show up in the form of loneliness or fear of rejection or fear of success, feeling like you don't make a difference. And again, when we go back to the law of mind action, thoughts held in mind produce after their kind, positive or negative, build on themselves. So a man by the name of Greg Winch, he's a psychologist, has been studying the concept of loneliness and how it can build on itself. That, it starts out small, like maybe your best friend gets married or has a kid or moves away, or you get a new job or you move. And then, but what he's saying is that the more separated we become, it kind of builds on its own, again, producing after its kind, where we begin to tell ourselves, well, it doesn't matter, or they don't really care. And a great example of this is, he said that he's a twin. And he's from another country, and he came to the U.S. in the 80s to study. And it was the first time that he'd been separated from his brother, and they were twins. I mean, they were like this. They did everything together. And because phone calls were so expensive back in the 80s, they could only talk for like 2 minutes a week, if that. So they decided on their birthdays that they would treat themselves and they would have a 10-minute phone conversation. And he was so excited that he was going to talk to his brother for 10 whole minutes that he woke up early in the morning and he's cleaning the house and he's pacing and he could not relax, and his brother didn't call, and his brother didn't call, and his brother didn't call. And the day was over, and he was like, well, I guess my brother got busy, or maybe he forgot about me, or, and he just kind of went into this funk and went to bed. And the next morning he woke up still upset that his brother never called. And then he went to the phone and he noticed that in his pacing, he had accidentally kicked the phone off the receiver. He'd knocked it off. So he picked up the phone, hung it up. 2 minutes later, phone rang, it's his brother. And his brother says, where have you been? I have been worried sick. I called you all day yesterday and you never answered the phone. And so he explained to him. He said, well, I thought that, you got busy or you didn't care or whatever. And his brother said, if you thought that, then why didn't you call me? Right? So there it is, that acedia, that getting lost in all these thoughts. There's no basis for them. There's no foundation to them at all. And that being pulled out of it, of just make the phone call yourself, right? Just step out into that. So that's one of the ways that it forms, or that it shows up. Guy Winch said that distorted perceptions have a huge ripple effect, creating self-fulfilling prophecies that ensnare many. So again, we can create these stories that have no validity. Now, Myrtle Fillmore, the co-founder of Unity, countered thoughts of illness, and she had to do it very consciously because her whole life she was told that, she had this illness and that she was sickly, and, that's the message that she got her whole life. And then when she heard the lecture that you're a child of God and you don't inherit illness, she countered it. She began to counter the acedia. She began to tell her body, talk to her body and say that I'm a child of God, that I can't inherit illness, and blessed every part of her body and was healed. What about rejection as a way of falling into that trap? How many of us are afraid that we're going to be rejected, and so we don't even try? Another form of that noonday demon, if you will. And a man by the name of Ji Zhang, he's from China. He was really afraid of being rejected because of some childhood trauma that he had. And what he noticed was that it was stopping him from succeeding in life. It was stopping him from asking for help or asking for an investment or whatever it was he needed. He wouldn't do it. And so in the wisdom of Google, he Googled rejection, and he found this challenge by a man named Jason Cornley. It's called rejection therapy. And the idea is that it's a game that you go for 30 days every day, and your goal is to be rejected. So he thought, all right, I'm going to try this because, maybe it'll immune me to being rejected. So he thought, all right, I know what I can do. Tomorrow, I'm going to go up to a stranger, and I'm going to ask if I can borrow $100. So he goes to work, and the security guard's in the lobby, and he walks up to him, and he says, hi. He said, could I borrow $100? And the security guard just looked at him and said, no, you can't borrow $100. Why? And he ran away. He just ran away and hid. He said the next day he went to a fast food place, and he ordered his burger and ate it, and he came back, and he said, can I have a burger refill? And they're like, what are you talking about? Because, you give coffee refills. No, you can't have a burger refill. Okay, but then the guy tried to explain, well, maybe I should talk to my manager, maybe it's something we should do. And he's noticing that it's not just a straight-on no, that it doesn't have anything to do with him, that there's nothing wrong with him. So then another day he goes to Krispy Kreme, and he goes into Krispy Kreme and he says, can you give me some donuts that look like Olympic symbols? And they're like, what do you mean? And he says, you could interlink 5 donuts together so it has that symbol of the Olympic rings. And the manager was like, well, maybe. So she started drawing. She goes in the back room, and 15 minutes later, she brings out a box of Krispy Kremes in the shape of the Olympic rings. So he's beginning then to have fun with all of this. Another day, he has a flower, so he knocks on someone's door, a stranger, and he says, hi, I have a flower. Can I plant it in your yard? And the guy says, no, you can't. And again, there was that no, you can't. But then he said, but why? And he said, because I have a dog, and the dog will dig it up. Go across the street, knock on her door. She'll let you plant the flower, and of course he did. So what began to happen for him was that he began to shift and change, and he no longer was not only not afraid of rejection, but all the thoughts that went along with it. There were like a zillion thoughts that went along with why you're not good enough, you're crazy, you're this, you're that. And it began to short circuit those thoughts that he had around that so that he could begin to move forward in his life, and he could begin to be more successful, that he could try more things, because that fear, that acedia was showing up in him not being able to accept rejection. He no longer froze when he thought he was going to try something new. So what is the acedia for you? What is it that stops you before you even get started? What are those thoughts that can freeze you when you need to move forward, or you find yourself in this place of, I don't know? How do you get out of that? What is it that works for you? Is it nature? Is it prayer? Is it calling a friend? Because it does take action on our part. It's not, if we stay in that space, again, it'll grow on its own, but we can short circuit it and reach out, coming here and worshiping together and singing together and being in spiritual community. So I have one last story that speaks to this same issue, and it's actually about Debbie Reynolds, of all people. And she was 19 years old when she got the part in Singing in the Rain. It's her first movie. She's never done anything like this before. And here's the deal, she wasn't a dancer. She couldn't dance, right? So she gets cast in this film with Fred Astaire and Gene Kelly for Singing in the Rain. And she was practicing and practicing and practicing, dancing for, 12 hours a day. Her feet were bloody and blistered, and still she would screw it up. And Gene Kelly was so mad that she was cast in this part because he knew there were so many other actresses out there who could dance, who could do the part better than her. And he would criticize her and criticize her. And of course, she already had those voices in her own head that were criticizing and asking her what in the world was she doing. She said one day she just had it because she just couldn't seem to get it. And, everyone had left the studio, the rehearsal studio. And she said she just couldn't take it anymore. So she crawled under the piano. And she's laying under the piano in the dark. And she's crying and just sobbing, like, why am I doing this? And I have to quit. And I have to get out of here. And this is stupid. And then she looks up and she sees a pair of shoes and pant legs. Somebody was in the room listening to her. And it was Fred Astaire. And he said, what's wrong? And so she began to tell him. And he said, do you know how hard it is for me to dance in the way that I do? Do you think that this comes easy for me? He said, when I rehearse, I never let anybody even in the room so that they can't see my mistakes because I am so hard on myself. And then he helped her up and he said, you come with me. And he took her to his studio and together he worked on the part and he danced with her. And obviously, she was in the movie. Obviously, it was a great success. And obviously, she kept up with both of those guys in heels, right? And probably doing it backwards sometimes. But so he invited her in. Fred Astaire invited her in. He invited her to become as a little child. He appealed to her better angels so that she wouldn't get lost in that funk that can happen. So unity is founded on this principle. Unity is founded on the law of mind action. It's founded on the goodness of God, on the presence of God that is within us. And so as divine beings, the truth is we're more than our thoughts. Even our positive thoughts, we're more than that. We're more than our physical bodies. We are these divine beings, and we have access to divine ideas and limited potential within the law of physics, But the only thing that usually stops us is what? It's our own mind, right? It's our own thoughts. So the next time you think about how can I begin again and what can I do, if that can't voice shows up, ask yourself, is that true? Is it true? Because there's very few things you can't fly. Okay, there's certain things you can't do. You can't fly. But so many other things, we have that unlimited potential within us. And that's what Charles and Myrtle Fillmore showed us. It's what we built the Unity movement on. Myrtle healed herself. She not only healed herself, but she became a conduit of healing for other people, for the community, so that it grew into this unity movement. The founders of this church, they had a vision of beginning again and creating something wonderful so that we could be uplifted, so that when we found ourselves in acedia, we had a community that could reflect our better angels back to ourselves. Again, Paul said, do not conform to the pattern of this world. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. The pattern of the world will drag you down if it can, with all the stuff that there is to sort through, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. It takes discipline. It takes energy. It takes action. But one thought can turn it around. One phone call can turn it around. One prayer can turn it around. So let's take this into prayer. Let's take this into meditation, recognizing that we're more than these thoughts. So I invite you to turn your attention within. And I'm going to go back to the acedia. What is your acedia? What is your personal noonday demon that calls you down, that brings you down, that stops you in your tracks before you even get started? Just identify it for a moment. What is your acedia? And recognize that that's only a thought. It is a thought that has no real power. And what's the counter to that? If the acedia for you is loneliness, what's the counter? If it's fear of rejection, what's the counter? If it's negative self-talk, what's the counter? For Myrtle Fillmore said that God is the only reality of us. God is the only reality of us. All else is but a shadow. When we let light flood us with its sunshine, all clouds vanish, and we begin to see ourselves in new ways of doing, which lead to wholeness and health and satisfaction and growth. And so we consecrate ourselves right now to Spirit and to doing daily that which we feel led to do. So may we prosper, may we heal, may we bring healing and comfort to others. And it is for this awareness, in the name and through the power of the living Christ, that we say thank you and amen.